We're just waiting a couple of minutes for folks to come in from reminiscing in the hallway. It's always wonderful when alums get together to remember when and compare it to the here and now. So, well, it's good that we still remember the when and where. Yeah, exactly. Memory is selective sometimes. But good morning, church. It's so good to see you all this morning. I'm Pastor Martin Otto Zimmern, the Senior Director of Kindling Faith Continuing Education, and we have an amazing day ahead of us. I'm so excited about our guest speakers today and the wonderful things they've experienced and are going to share with us. And to start us off this morning, I want to welcome President Guy Irwin up to the podium to say hello and greetings, and then we'll go from there.
Good morning to all of you. It's wonderful to have you here, especially returning alumni. No matter what campus you were on when you were studying at ULS, you're welcome here. And for those who graduated from the Philadelphia campus, welcome back. It's a delight to have this time to welcome folks back, to be back together in person as each successive year brings greater attendance in person at our events. That's exciting to us as well. We know that you make sacrifices to be here, and we're grateful for that. I want to say that these days have been especially rich and challenging, and I'm anticipating, of course, today as well. Yesterday's UTI lecture was amazing, and I got to spend some special time yesterday evening with the 50th reunion class. These are people who have a long perspective on things, and it was delightful to see the great joy with which they had come together again, the immediate rapport that they returned to, the kind of teasing and affection that went back to many years ago in seminary. But they also were very clear about how happy they were that so many things have changed since then. We've crossed all kinds of frontiers in those 50 years, and we continue to stride into the future. Today's speaker will challenge us in that way, as indeed yesterday's did too. So again, welcome to this feast. We're happy to set the table for rich thought and take advantage of your time here. Welcome. Thank you, Mark.
And also welcome to the many of you who are joining us from afar, from cyberspace. I am going to be watching on the YouTube channel so that during the time of Q&A, if you have a question that you would like to ask our presenters, I'll be happy to step up to the microphone on your behalf and hopefully use the same inflection that you would use if you were here in person. Also, just a moment to shill for Kindling Faith. There are flyers out on the table with copies of Raising Kids Beyond the Binary for all upcoming events that may be of interest for rostered and lay people. I hope that you will avail yourself of the opportunity to see the smorgasbord that we are, that's one of the words I need to use more often, of items that we have available for continuing education, both online and in person. So please do take advantage of that. Our author, Jamie Brusoff, will be signing books after both sessions today, if that's okay, and right before chapel and again after our afternoon session. Chapel, of course, is at noon in the chapel, and if you don't know where that is, just follow the crowd. So I am going to introduce a close friend and colleague, Deacon Shell Huth, who is also a close friend and colleague to the Brusoffs, and she can introduce them. So.
Why, thank you. Super excited to share with you, my friends and colleagues. We've known each other longer than we can actually think of when we met. Chris is a graduate of Chicago Lutheran Seminary. That's okay, we still love you. And Jamie and I were on the Gettysburg campus at the same time, and we've been in ministry for many years together, mainly around children and youth ministry. And so they come to us today with a wealth of experience and knowledge, and are people who are living out the calling to be inclusive and to share God's claiming of each and every one of us, because God has created each and every one of us beautifully and individually. And I have learned so much from them over these years of working together and being friends, and just celebrate who they are and what they're bringing to all of us today. And so I'm going to stop talking so we can hear more from them. So please welcome Jamie and Chris Brushoff.
Thank you, friends. Thank you. All right. Good morning. I'm gonna find a clicker here. You good? You're gonna start us off?
Yeah. So this morning, rather throughout the day, our goal is to talk about how, as communities of faith, we are doing our best, or how we can do our best to welcome, provide safe space, and celebrate our transgender and non-binary community members, especially our youth and our young people. That's the group that we generally are going to be talking with and through and about as we gather our time today. This morning specifically, we're going to be looking beyond ball fields and bathrooms. As most of you know, our somewhat pithy title here sort of mentions two places where most of our society today has encountered, in the media and in politics, transgender and non-binary people. And we need to move past that. And we need to figure out instead what we do as communities of faith specifically, and as individuals who are doing ministry in these places. So that's kind of the general overview. My name is Chris Brushoff. I am a pastor in New Jersey. I have been a pastor for 21 years, and yes, I graduated from the seminary in Chicago. I am also a dad to 3 kiddos. We'll talk about them later. And that's sort of the lens that I approach things with. I use he, him pronouns, and I identify as cisgender. If you don't know what that means, we'll talk about that too.
So a little bit about what we're going to do with our time this morning, and then we'll have part 2 this afternoon. So somebody had asked earlier this morning if they were different. They are different. We're going to cover content throughout them all. So we're going to talk about how we got here, specifically in doing this work, a little bit of the landscape of the world around us, because there's a lot going on and most of it isn't good. And so that's really important for us to understand in order to be able to respond effectively. And then what does this mean for us as people of faith and people in ministry will kind of be what we're going to do this morning. Chris shared some of it, the lenses that he brings to this work, and I'll share some of the lenses that I bring to this work. I am a parent of 3. I have an MAR from Gettysburg, from this lovely institution, and my work has been largely focused in youth and outdoor ministry. Now, as Chris said, we are going to, you'll hear us talk a lot from the lens of youth and young adults. This applies to everyone. So that foundation, know that everything you're learning about how best to show up for young people actually applies to adults as well, and just talks about what it means to be the church together. But that is the lens with which we come with. I personally identify as part of the queer community, but I am cisgender. I am not trans. I use pronouns like she, her, and they, them. They both feel really great to me, so you can use any of them. But it's really important for me to say up front that I am not speaking for trans people, neither is Chris, or for non-binary people. We are bringing our own lived experience, informed by our relationship with many people, including our own daughter, which we'll talk about, but we cannot speak for them, and we would never want to. And if you have heard one story of one family or one trans or non-binary person, you have heard one story. The community is not a monolith in any way, and so this is kind of an entry into that, but you need to know that there is great diversity of experiences and opinions within this community like any other. The other thing that I need to share as we start off our time together is that our story as parents and as professionals cannot be fully extracted from our daughter's story. Our oldest child, our daughter Rebecca, is transgender and is how we ended up in this work, which we'll share more about. But they are intertwined so deeply, and yet her story belongs to her. And so everything that I share or that Chris shares, we share with her explicit permission. And that is critical because this is her story and that belongs to her. This book, Raising Kids Beyond the Binary, it has an afterword that's written by Rebecca, which is a wonderful gift, but she also consulted on and advised on and approved of every single word in that book. It was probably the most terrifying part of writing this book, was handing her, after advising along the way, the nearly finished manuscript and saying, it's your turn, read through, flag absolutely anything I've missed or you don't want in it. And I heard her up in her room like giggling, and I was like, is that a good laugh? Is that a good? She's like, Mom, you said the thing. I'm like, is that a good thing? Yes, that's a good thing. And so it is approved by and endorsed by her, and that is critically important. It also has a foreword by Senator Sarah McBride, who is an incredible transgender woman and leader running for the Senate right now. She's a state senator in Delaware and running for Senate for the U.S. Senate right now. And it was really important to us and our family that our words be bookended always by trans people, because that is what this is about. So other lenses I bring, I think that's everything. Yes, we're good? Cool. So now, in order to get to where we're going, I want to share a little bit of that story and how we got to where we are. And so Rebecca is our first child. We often say that she came out of the womb demanding her voice be heard or no one was going to sleep again. And so we quickly discovered that we needed to throw out all the parenting books and not listen to anyone else's advice and follow this baby in front of us as lead. And that really served us so well on this journey thus far. By the time she was 2 or 3, she gravitated to typically girly things, whatever that means, but pink and purple and sparkles and all of those things. We never thought, hey, that must mean you're a girl. We said colors are for everyone, clothes are for everyone, and you can be any kind of boy you want to be. This is her at 3 years old, again, shared with her permission. She was going to be in a play at preschool, and she was cast as a bird, and she wanted to be a pink bird. So I was like, okay, I thought tropical, and we went with it. I am the least crafty person you know. Chris helped, and he's a different kind of crafty. And so this is held together with spray adhesive and staples. Like, that's the kind of crafty we are. But she was thrilled. We sprayed her hair pink, the whole thing. And so as we're sitting in the pews of the church where the preschool play was happening, all excited to see our little one's stage debut, got my phone ready recording, and she comes on stage, and our jaws kind of dropped because we realized that when they said birds, they meant seagulls. And all of the other children made their way on stage in their gray and their white, and there was our bright pink little boy, or so we thought. But honestly, that fit her perfectly. As she got older, her gender nonconformity, a word that we learned along the way, intensified. She was just really not comfortable with anything in that box marked boy. And again, we didn't think that meant she was a girl. We thought maybe she'll be gay. We wondered about who she would turn out being, but we followed her lead and supported her along the way. And eventually that journey, that gender nonconformity came along with a lot of anxiety and eventually some depression. And so we ended up with a 7-year-old who was in crisis. And nothing in those parenting books that we had already thrown out anyway prepares you for that. Our culture, society doesn't deal well with mental health struggles as a whole, but they really don't when you're talking about young children. And so people would say, well, what does a 7-year-old have to be depressed about? Well, that's not how depression works. And also, if I knew that, I would fix it and figure it out. And so it was with the help of family or support network, therapists, her family doctor, and so on, that we were able to kind of peel back the layers of what she was experiencing to give her space. And when we gave her space, she was able to unpack her identity. And that's when she said, I don't think I'm a boy who likes girl things. I think I'm a girl. That had just been the language that she had been using using to kind of communicate with us. And so she learned the word transgender, and that was a big aha moment. She said, oh, maybe that's what I am. And as a parent, I said, oh, maybe that's what you are. And from the day she learned the word transgender till she went out into the world as herself for the first time, it was 6 weeks. Suddenly things just came into place because she had that language, that terminology was so powerful in giving her permission, in empowering her and being able to articulate and communicate with the people around her about who she was, and understanding that she wasn't alone, that there was a community of other people that experienced the world that she did. And so at 8 years old, she went out into the world for the first time as Rebecca. And as parents, we were terrified. This was almost 10 years ago now, so there was a lot less information than there is available now. And we had read all the books, asked all the professionals, done all the things, but in the end we said, listen, all we're doing is changing her name and her pronouns so that she can go out into the world as herself. If this is wrong, if we've got it all wrong, we'll just change those back. And so we kind of took a deep breath and made this leap, but it was really obvious the second that she went out into the world as herself that this is who she was meant to be. This is who God created her to be. She was happy, she was confident, any of those lingering symptoms of depression and anxiety just disappeared because she didn't have to pretend she was someone she wasn't anymore. And we had the joy then of walking with our community, with the people around us, our family, our friends, our extended family, our local community, our church community. Chris was serving as the pastor of a small congregation in a rural conservative part of New Jersey. I always say that rural and conservative in New Jersey may not mean what they mean elsewhere, but there were cows in our backyard. That's my rural cred, I feel like. And so we got to walk with our congregation on this journey of what does it look like to support this little girl.
And for us, that meant first and foremost, we were going to figure out how to keep Rebecca safe. We were going to set some boundaries and parameters that were going to keep her safe first as the person who is most vulnerable in what's going on right now. So we talked, and we knew that doing this might mean that my call was going to end and we were going to have to move. That was something we had to state kind of out loud in our living room one night as we were sort of discussing what it was going to be and what that reality looked like. And then we said, well, what's the plan? And we decided to put what I affectionately call the church rumor mill to good use. And we said, I'm going to talk to a select number of leaders who I happen to trust, and we're going to tell them that these are the rules, and this is what we're going to do. And the rules went something like this. If you have questions, we want you to ask them. Here's what that's going to look like. You can't ask them in front of Rebecca. You have to use Rebecca's name and Rebecca's pronouns. And we will find you answers either from ourselves or from other trusted resources, and we will go from there. And so I started with my then congregational president, who told me, Pastor, I'm so glad. She was a teacher in the community. 4 years ago, I had a kid transition in my classroom, and we had no idea what to do. I'm ready to do this with you. And I had no idea what that story was, and she is a fabulous human being. And we went from there. And slowly but surely, we had conversations. We didn't always have them personally. Other people had them. But that spread out to a point where folks were, if not celebratory and accepting, they were at least at a place where they were comfortable figuring it out, which I sort of lay as the baseline for that conversation.
100%. And by doing that, we were able to create space for them to have questions, not understand, not be ready. We said, listen, you don't have to endorse our parenting decisions. You don't have to come to church on Sunday waving a pride flag, although that would be lovely, but we don't expect anyone to. But you have to, we put this protective bubble around Rebecca so that we could walk alongside other people with their questions. And the first Sunday that Rebecca showed up at church as herself, after we'd kind of disseminated this information and allowed people to have their first reactions and hopefully maybe their second reactions before they got to us, I was terrified. I believe you were terrified too. I mean, we were holding our breath a lot. She wore that adorable pink or purple dress you saw up there. And There was one particular person that I was like, if there's going to be someone who's going to have a problem, it's this guy. He had an opinion about everything, and everyone on his Facebook page knew it. And those opinions did not align with my opinions. We were just very different. And he was very outspoken, and I was like, okay, if there's gonna be one person that's gonna like blow this up in front of us, it's gonna be this guy. And so church ended, and I held my breath, like we'd gotten through service, and he made a beeline to shake hands with him. And I was like, oh no, this is when it's gonna happen. And I held my breath, and he went up to Chris and he said, listen, I don't understand this whole transgender thing. But she used to hide behind you and refuse to say hi to me on a Sunday morning. And today, she ran up to me, twirled in her dress, and gave me a high five. What more is there to know? And the truth is, there's a lot more to know. We're going to spend the day learning a lot of what there is more to know, but that's the foundation. That's the foundation with which our family has done all of the work we've done. That when we move something from an issue to a human being in front of you, and you see someone step into who God created them to be, it's hard to not see it. And so he had all sorts of questions, and our politics will never align, but he saw the little girl in front of him who was happy and who was being herself in the most beautiful way. So as we walked with our congregation, we continued to create this space of learning and conversation. That protective bubble was fierce around Rebecca. We really kind of kept conversations separate, and we walked with them and really just kind of stayed in community with them. We were doing advocacy work out in the world, but there was a little bit of a separation between our church and that because we were meeting people where they were, and our church wasn't ready for the advocacy work we were doing out in the world. And so over the course of 2 years, we stayed in community with them. They got to continue to see who we are, get to know who Rebecca was in the fullness of her identity. And 2 years after she transitioned, on the 10th anniversary of her baptism, we had a name blessing where her grandfather, who was also a pastor who had baptized her, came and presided over it, and her godparents were present. And we blessed her in her forever name in that moment and allowed our congregation to come alongside us and have this moment where they'd done the learning, they'd done the community building, and we're ready to say, yes, we love and support this child of God in being who she's meant to be. So now, fast forward a while, Rebecca is 17 years old. She's a high school senior, which is terrifying to me. And more often than not, she is absolutely a typical teenager. If I could get her to clean her room, that would be amazing. We just had an incident last week where we might have put a graphing calculator through the wash. That was not a good day. She's just a typical teenager. And so that's wonderful that she just gets to be Rebecca. She's also a fierce advocate who has been advocating publicly since she was 10 years old. She spent almost half her life fighting for her right to exist and the rights of all kids like her to have access to safe and supportive schools, communities, families, homes, and churches.
She wrote a book.
Yeah, that's the book she wrote. She's holding. Sorry. It's a kid's book about being inclusive. Lovely book. She started her advocacy journey when she was 10 years old. And the federal administration had rescinded the guidance for transgender students in schools. And so it was the first action of going backwards, and it was really scary for us all. And so I reached out to an advocacy organization in New Jersey, Garden State Equality. They were hosting a rally, and I said, hey, you're having a rally. I'm a parent, and if you need a parent to speak, I'd be happy to talk. And they said, yeah, you and Rebecca can speak. And I said, what? She's 10. And then I was like, okay, well, I've got to ask Rebecca. And so I asked her, and she said yes. She said, she knew that she had had a wonderful experience in schools. She had access to safety and support on so many levels, and she wanted to say that this is important and every kid deserves this. And so she had this sign, I'm the scary transgender person the media warned you about, in her pink puffy coat and her little pink pigtails. I always say she's not scary unless you're her two little brothers, because that's a thing. She stood in the streets of Jersey City in front of 200 people and shared her story. And that was incredible and powerful and amazing because she was 10. But the other thing that happened at that rally was that she heard the stories of other people. She heard the stories of other speakers who hadn't had the love and support that she'd had, that had had much rockier times in school and in jobs, adults that had lost their jobs, had lost their housing, had lost their entire communities, and she realized this kind of protective bubble we had put around her and what the wider world looked like. And so after that rally, I posted this picture online with my little blog that I had at the time, and it went viral. And so suddenly my 10-year-old was coming home from school, and I was like, Teen Vogue wants an interview, Yahoo News, would you talk to, Huffington Post? And she was like, what is happening? Why do these people care? Why do they want to hear from me? And it's because she had struck a chord with this message. But she said yes to those interviews because she realized that other people didn't have the support she did, and that she was given a platform and that she was ready to use it. And so we've spent the past almost 8 years doing this work on a very public level in faith spaces and not in faith spaces, and it's been really wonderful and affirming and empowering, and we've made wonderful connections, and it's been really ugly at times. We get death threats. We've had child abuse investigations. We get a lot of hate, and I need to name that the most awful hate we get is in the name of Jesus. And so the fact that we are a family of faith, that she is a pastor's kid, and we take up space in a very public way and saying this is who God created her to be, makes people really upset. And so as much as she's a typical high school kid worried about school and classes and college applications now and all the things, she also lives with all of this responsibility and the trauma that goes with it, to be honest. And sometimes that trauma looks like really big things, and other times it's really small things. This is our family, a couple of years ago now, I guess. And we're a typical family in all sorts of ways. And also, there are many places where our family would not be welcome. There are many churches where Chris could not serve. When we moved 4 years ago, going through the call process was terrifying. And that is not new. And we have a lot of privilege because we look like this and can be this kind of like white picket fence family. And yet also, half of our family is queer in some way, shape, or form. Or 2/5. We've got two out for debate. I don't know. They'll let us know someday. But there's a lot of things that don't. And so understanding the impact of that is another thing. Other times it's in really small ways. Rebecca, as a freshman in high school, was in a biology class. And she's a really good student. She's first in her class. She doesn't love that I tell people that, but she does give me permission. She's very humble, which is wonderful. And in this biology class, they were learning about genetics. And there was a quiz that was it was a comprehension check. And one of the questions was, what are your sex chromosomes? And she was like, well, do I tell the truth and out myself, because then I'll have to explain why I answered this way and that the answer is correct, or do I lie because the teacher didn't happen to know that she was transgender? And so she got to that question, and all of her friends got to that question and looked over to her because they realized that it was going to be a problem, and what does that look like?
By the way, they all aced comprehension at that point.
It's true. And so in the end, she ended up lying and not wanting to have the conversation. And then I do professional development for the school district now, and we have talked through all of that. But the fact that just a simple quiz you get to may create this moment that stops you entirely in your track and reminds you that you are not like everyone else. And that's a big thing. I said she was getting ready to apply to colleges. She's tackling the SAT. She had an SAT tutor that she was working with virtually, and he was supposed to be working on SAT math with her. And he began to go off about how she was going to college, and he had no idea she was transgender, going to college, and that as long as she avoids the woke Marxist cult where they believe that boys can be girls and girls can be boys, and it's okay for them to play sports, which, by the way, she does, that she would be fine. And she had to sit there and smile and nod through a Zoom with this person in a position of power in that moment and try to figure out how to deal with that. And so as much as she has a lot of privilege, a lot of support, and a lot of things that make navigating the world a lot easier for her than it does for a lot of other people, it's still not easy. And yet, there is a lot of hope. There is a lot of hope in the world. I spend I spend all day, every day doing this work. I travel across the country. I work with schools and businesses and churches and camps. I get to do a lot of work with our outdoor ministries and families. And I hear a lot of horrible, hard things. The news is filled with horrible, hard things. And yet there is so much hope. Because in Rebecca and the so many other trans and non-binary young people that I get to work with, you see what's possible when they have love and support. You see how the world is better and brighter when they get to show up as themselves. You see how the world and our communities are shifted. You know, being her mom has taught us, her parents has taught us what it means to love the person in front of you for who they are. Not who you thought they were or who you expected them to be or wished they would be, but who they are. Being in relationship with trans and non-binary people of all ages has made me a better human being that dares to show up more fully as my own self in the world around me. And so there is a lot of hope.
Wouldn't it be amazing if every little Rebecca, every family knew that at your church, every young person would be safe, loved, and celebrated in the fullness of their identity? When we talk about hope, I kind of flash back to that picture of Rebecca in the streets of Jersey City. Because if you want to know what it looks like when young transgender and non-binary people are supported, affirmed, and celebrated, it looks like a 10-year-old who is willing to share their voice with complete strangers and tell their story. It looks like that identity being something that isn't kind of shamed or pushed aside, but rather something that's lived out loud for everyone to enjoy, to experience, and to see how all of who God made us to be is something that all of us need to have an experience with together. When so much of our culture wants to point out brokenness, I think that as church, we say, listen, we know the reality of brokenness. We also know the joy of forgiveness and wholeness that comes through that journey. And that's writ large in my experience with Rebecca and her community.
Mm-hmm. And so if this is the goal, we have to talk about what the landscape looks like right now. What does the world say and what is the world doing? Like I said, it's largely not very good. A little bit of information about LGBTQ plus identities as a whole. And so this is data from the Gallup poll that was published in January 2024, so it was from the 2023 Gallup poll. And it's the number of US adults who self-identify as LGBTQ plus by generation. And what is incredible to look at here is that 22.3% of Gen Z identifies as part of the LGBTQ plus community. There's actually other data that came out about a year ago now from other sources that put it closer to 30%. And so understanding that the world is increasingly queer, and that is a wonderful thing now. We hear that, and sometimes people go, well, is it because it's in the water? Is it because it's in the vaccines or the GMOs or whatever it is? I have heard it all. It's not, I promise, it's not contagious. It's because there is access to more information and more acceptance despite what we're about to see as far as the national landscape. Because access to community and information and the internet with all of its pluses and minuses is a really huge gift. Social media to young people who are able to find people like them even when they are living in places where they can't find those in person. And so understanding this, this kind of look at by generation, but they're all going up. So overall, about 7.6% of Americans identify as as part of the LGBTQ plus community. That has doubled since 2014. So that's huge. This understanding and this growth in knowing who we are and being willing to claim it publicly. It's not that actually more people are LGBTQ plus, it's that they're willing to claim it publicly. We know that LGBTQ plus people and gender diverse people specifically have existed throughout history and around the world. And so this is not a new fad. We see it in, we can see it in biological diversity in insects and animals and birds and fish and all sorts of things, and also through, as we look through the anthropological history of the world. And so those are really interesting things if you want to dive into them. There's some resources in the back of the book or Google, all of those things. Check your sources if you Google, but Google can be your friend. So understanding that we are growing, like there's this more understanding and awareness and this critical mass of people that are claiming this identity. At the same time, each year we have seen increasing numbers of anti-LGBTQ+ and specifically anti-trans legislation. And so these are graphs showing 2021, 2022, 2023, and now 2024. The yellow is the number of bills that were introduced, and then the blue is the number of bills that have passed. And so this year, the most recent count I found was 658 anti-trans bills were introduced in state legislators as well as federal across the country. Right now, we have 45 bills that were passed this year. 125 bills are still active in states in 43 states, and the 80 unprecedented number of bills at the federal level that impact this community. This is huge. Even if they don't get passed, we see this huge number that don't get passed, them being introduced, them being debated, harms young people and people of all ages. It creates that their identity is a topic of conversation around dinner tables, around state houses, around Board of Ed meetings, everywhere, and that it's like this debate that everybody gets to weigh in on when it's who these people are. It is their identity. And so they've been made into these political footballs, and the impact is incredibly real. The areas of these bills, overwhelmingly this year we've seen education, almost 200 bills reflected in education, with healthcare, sports, performance, so that's like drag bans and things like that. We've seen a resurgence of bathroom bills that we hadn't seen for a couple of years, and then other things cover child abuse, employment, military service, birth certificates, marriage, incarcerations, and civil rights. Primarily, we're seeing school bills that impact our ability to provide safe educational settings for young people, including bills that force outing, meaning parents or teachers would have to out young people who they discover are part of the community to their parents when many of them are not safe at home, and so that's super dangerous. We've seen book bans and curriculum bans, bathroom bans in schools, athletic bans, which are a big conversation. We can get into that later, but please know that trans kids play sports for the reason that all kids play sports, to do something they love, have fun with their friends, and be a part of a team. And on the K-12 level, there is really nothing at risk there by allowing them to participate. We continue to hear, as we work towards a presidential election, that transgender people are at the heart of so many of our debates. Trump continues to repeat false claims that children are undergoing transgender surgery during the school day. I mean, that is the most important part of that headline, during the school day. Last time I checked, we can't pay our teachers a livable wage in most states, but...
They're not allowed to give out Tylenol.
That too. But they are having surgery during the school day. And Moms for Liberty founder said that she was thankful for this surgery lie because it was getting people talking and concerned about what was happening in our schools. And so understanding, again, I will say this, I don't care what your personal politics are. I can tell you where my faith calls me to be, but you need to understand what young people, families, and adults in this community are experiencing and absorbing as a result of the political discourse. And so that is one thing. At the same time, as state laws continue to target transgender children, families flee and become political refugees. We've seen families fleeing states all over the country, Texas, Kansas, Missouri, Idaho, fleeing Florida because they can't access the very medically necessary and evidence-based health care that their child requires because their schools are no longer safe. They are selling everyone. They are leaving their jobs, selling everything, leaving their jobs, leaving their families, and fleeing to what they consider a safer state. But here's the thing, that list of safer states is dwindling. Nowhere is safe until everywhere is safe. And so this is the very real impact. We also have people fleeing the country for that very reason as well. But this is the actual impact of the political conversations having on families and adults that are fleeing as well. Okay, so this is data from the Trevor Project's 2024 survey on youth mental health. This is transgender and non-binary folks specific. 71% of respondents said that they have experienced anxiety recently. 59% said they had experienced depression recently, and 46% said they had seriously considered suicide in the past year. 46%. That's nearly half. They are not considering these things because there is something wrong with them. They are not struggling because there is something wrong with them. They are struggling because of what they face in society and the messages they are being told about who they are. On the flip side, we can look at the access to affirming spaces. Only 38% had access to an affirming space in their homes from their family, the very people who are supposed to love them unconditionally. 54% said they had access to a safe school, and we have 3% said they had access to an affirming worship space. 3% of the, I think it was like 28,000 trans or LGBTQ young people who responded to the survey, and that data specifically to trans youth. We have a problem. People of faith, specifically Christians, have done and continue to do the most significant harm to this community personally and politically. And it is up to us to change that, to not say not all Christians, to not say not all churches, but to be as vocally inclusive and celebratory and advocating for this community as those who are advocating against it in the name of Jesus. And then when we talk about the politics, how often have recent politics negatively impacted your well-being? And we have 10% said never, with the overwhelming majority saying sometimes or a lot. And that's whether they're in a state where they have statewide protections, like we're in New Jersey, and we have great statewide protections, and still there's federal bills at play, and also the national conversation really impacts these young people. Do you have anything you want to add there? Okay. I promise I let him talk. So on the flip side, again, we're doing this like really hard stuff and then hope, and really hard stuff and hope, because that's what it is. It's this push and pull. And there is so much help because these young people do not struggle because there's something wrong with them. I will say it again and again. These young people pictured here are
Champions.
Six champions with the Gender Cool Project. The Gender Cool Project is a national organization that works to replace misinformed opinions with positive real-life interactions, meeting trans and non-binary young people who are thriving. And they do this in areas of policy and business and visibility. They have introduced the President of the United States. They have been on the front page of the USA Today. They've been on television, all of those kinds of things. But it's really about who they are. These young people are thriving and incredible. And it's not because they're trans, and it's not because they're trans. This is one part of who they are. They often, all of them, like to say, being transgender is the least interesting thing about me. It's an important part of their identity. They're not interested in hiding it, but they are so much more than that. They are future politicians and filmmakers and actors and business leaders and CEOs and so many other things. And so when we create space where voices like this can step in and bring the fullness of who they are, the world changes for the better. I've listened to these young people speak to 6,000 C-suite employees at businesses all over the country and talk about what it looks like to build a workplace that's ready for the next generation. Like, that's the kind of power that these young people have, and this is just one example. This is true. Trans and non-binary young people are the most incredible young people you will ever meet. They know themselves better than most adults I know because they have had to do the work to know themselves and advocate for themselves. And they are so extraordinary because they've had to advocate for themselves in ways that they shouldn't have to. They've had to be resilient in ways they shouldn't have to, but also because when they show up fully as themselves, they teach us more about the God who created all of us. Hope looks like Rebecca at 11 years old on stage at the ELCA Youth Gathering in 2018, speaking in front of over 30,000 high school students and adult leaders and saying that God does not make mistakes and that that she has hope for the church and the world, and that those 30,000 people are a part of that hope. And that was a beautiful moment, and I love, as I travel the country, the stories I get to hear, the continual ripples of that moment on congregations and individuals. The people that are said, like, you know, I came out to my youth group on the bus ride home, or pastors who said, I actually came out to my youth group because I watched them give her a standing ovation and realized they could handle that. I've also heard from pastors who said, oh, well, we were in the hallway, you know, not listening to her because we were protesting. So we never got to hear it. I was like, well, that's great. Thanks for sharing that with me. Really glad you felt the need to. But hope looks maybe even more so like 6 years later, Rebecca as an MC at this year's youth gathering in New Orleans. Not on stage to talk about being a transgender young person, but on stage to just be another young person in faith and getting to be her whole self. She got to share her identity too, and that was really important and powerful and impactful.
She was more excited about the t-shirt cannon. Let's just be clear.
It's true. The t-shirt cannon was a gift to her. She loved that. But getting to be her whole self and not needing to be the token trans person, but her whole self. That being transgender is just one piece about her that she didn't need to hide. She got to name that truth from the stage once again in front of 16,000 people, and had admittedly had a lot of young high school boys really wrestling with their own sexuality after they had gotten to know her for 2 days and really thought she was cute and then wondered what this means. And so some really cool conversations happened. And so what does that mean to actually create space where people get to show up fully as themselves? Yeah, oh, absolutely. Like, that's joy and that's hope. And like, the other thing is that it's important to know is, like, Rebecca's not special. I mean, she's special in all the ways that everybody is special. We're all God's children. And she's got some cool things that she's capable of doing. She's good in public speaking and all that, but she's not special. She's able to be this thriving, extraordinary young person because she had access to the medically necessary healthcare she needed, the love and support, affirming theology, a network of people who said, I see you and I believe you. And that is the most critical piece. She loves when we say you're not special. And she does, though, because she gets it. Like, and because she is really humble and she knows that this is part of the privilege of being who she is and being raised in the way that she has been raised. Yeah. Okay. We're going to pause here because I'd love to have some conversation. So when we come back in the afternoon, we're going to jump into talking about empathy and action. And I know we have a lot of time. It's okay. I see people checking their watches. This is on purpose. Don't worry. Because I can keep talking forever, as you can already tell, and he can talk too, even if you don't believe it. He's very gracious and lets me talk, let's be honest. But I'd actually love to know what you're wondering. And what are the questions you have in hearing this? I'm going to skip ahead and do one slide before we do questions because I'm realizing that I'd like you to have it. So just ignore that. Okay, so curiosity. I like to preface this before we do any open Q&A. Curiosity exists on a continuum. And this originally comes out of Reconciling Works, is a wonderful resource that they allow me to use wildly and share. And I credit them, I promise. But it exists on a continuum from hospitable curiosity on one side to lured curiosity on the other. Hospitable curiosity is curiosity that helps us show up better in relationship with one another. It helps us build a mutual trust and respect and build relationships. So it's needing to know what people need to access a space. What kind of bathrooms do they need to feel safe? How do we make sure we know their names and their pronouns and how to refer to them? And what are, like, we can talk about this in all sorts of communities. What are your accessibility needs? Like, do you need gluten-free food or whatever the case may be? Those are hospitable questions. Lured curiosity is the reason we all slow down on the highway when there's an accident on the side of the road. We just want to know what happened. It's human nature, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong. We don't need to vilify it, but we do need to be careful and understand where our questions are coming from. Are my questions in service to someone else, or are they just for me? Are they for my benefit? Asking people about the details of their bodies or what they do with them in intimate relationships is never hospitable. Ever. If you wouldn't want someone asking you the question, then you probably shouldn't be asking it of someone else. Now, I will say that sometimes there's a difference between being like, well, I just would like, I'm wondering, what does it look like to medically transition? And I would like to know more about what that looks like for the trans community. And that's a really big question. And that's an okay question to have. There's places you can get that information. Google can be your friend, check your sources. There are people that have shared their own personal journey. You can find documentaries, you can have social media platforms, books, all of those things. People that have chosen to do that labor and share that with others is a wonderful way to learn that. Whenever possible, pay those people for their labor. But the trans person that happens to be in front of you is not there to deliver Trans 101 to you. They're there to be in community and in relationship. And so it doesn't mean that you can't have those questions that maybe you wouldn't ask the person in front of you, but that you ask them somewhere else. Now, the next thing I will say is that in this space, we are here to graciously absorb clunky questions, and we will kindly tell you how you might ask it in a different way if you ask something that maybe shouldn't be asked. So I share this because I think this is an important lens, not only for you, but for the people you work with, but also want you to invite you to be vulnerable in asking questions, knowing that we will help guide you to a more hospitable place if necessary. Does that make sense? Okay.
The last piece, don't treat people like exotic oddities, right? And in some ways that kind of sums it up. If you're staring at somebody going, ooh, and you just want to know more for your sake, then that's what you're doing. And you should take a step back and evaluate that and see if there's a better way to come about it.
So with all that being said, are there questions, thoughts, concerns you have? I see one hand up there. There's a microphone up here, or I'm going to invite you to come to the microphone, I guess.
That's so that the folks
online can hear you.
Right. So this is just like at church. I had to explain to everybody now that we were doing church over the internet, you had to use microphones to do announcements, or the people at home, they don't get to hear you.
So I'm John Paul, professor of history here, and delighted by your presentation. Thank you very much. It's really quite powerful and moving. And I want to talk about another exotic oddity. You were all very careful politically, and I want to ask about MAGA, an exotic oddity. And I wonder, do you engage? Can you engage?
Yeah.
Or have you just written them off? Because as I see it, what the MAGA movement has done is intentionally created a scapegoat out of a vulnerable population, and at some point, you just do an end run around that, or do you confront it directly?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Do you want to talk
I think there's large pieces of that we're actually going to talk about
but I'm
in
going
the afternoon.
Yeah.
But if you want to.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of layers. Being in a relationship with people is critical to change hearts and minds. That is the most important thing. I also would say that it's important to care for your own well-being with how you engage. And so as someone, Rebecca might engage in some ways, usually just when she's feeling a little spicy, might she engage in some of those conversations, and other times it's better for her not to. But there might be places where I engage where she wouldn't want to, because I'm kind of that layer of support and protection. And then there are places where, you know what, I'm really tired and have had enough and don't need to engage, and so I need other allies. I need people that are not the parent of a trans kid, that are not openly queer, to have those conversations and to engage. And so I would say that's important. And then I would say, when we talk about advocacy, we do a lot of spectrums. You'll see, I'll talk more about other spectrums after lunch. But that we talk about the movable middle. And so people exist on a spectrum. And on one side, if we're talking about this particular issue, you have people who are, maybe waving those pride flags, running those pride parades, out there, out front, doing all the things, clearly 100% supportive, never going to change from that. And then you have people on this other extreme who are suggesting that children get surgeries while they're at school. And that are honestly advocating for a world where trans people do not exist. And that needs to be said. Here's the thing, I'm never going to change people's opinions on this side or on that side. But there are a whole lot of people that are in what we call the movable middle, that have heard some things and are just like, that sounds really bad. Who heard that they're doing surgeries at school and going, oh my gosh, that sounds terrible. I mean, I hope maybe somebody would be like, that's probably not happening. Look at our school budget crisis. But besides that, But even like on a more simple way, I know there was one time I went to go get lab work. I went to get just blood drawn for myself. And the phlebotomist saw that I had a shirt with a trans flag on it. First, she thought that I was pregnant, and I was very much not, and it was showing that I didn't know the gender. So I explained, no, I'm not pregnant, but that I have a transgender daughter. And she said, isn't it horrible that they're doing these surgeries on little children? Medical professional. And I said, so it's really interesting that you say that. They're actually not. That's not a thing. There's actually very clear guidelines and practices about how medical care is given, and that's not happening. Well, I heard it on the news when they were talking about, so-and-so, and I understand, and that must have been really confusing, but that's not happening. Here's the thing, if I had heard that they were doing surgeries on 5-year-olds, gender-affirming surgeries, I would go, that doesn't seem right, too. But I have information to tell me otherwise. And so it's getting to those people that have heard something that just doesn't sit right and being willing to correct misinformation, to enter into relationship with them and move them along. It's a lot of and you've got to deal with your own stuff that comes up with that, because you can have a very visceral reaction depending on what's said and how. And so there's a lot of breathing deep, paying attention to being in your body, making a little bit of space, and then stepping into that space. And then we just keep doing it. We're not going to get people from mile 1 to mile 26 like that of this marathon, but we can move people along in understanding. And so I would say, no, it's not always worth it, and sometimes it really is. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the work you are doing here. Going back to some of your earlier comments on the effort to construct a safety bubble around Rebecca, and the second point, I recall hearing something like, they will use her name, they will use her pronouns. May I invite you to speak to the practical interpersonal techniques that would have been involved with enforcing that, should it become necessary, while preserving safety?
So specifically, we were talking especially in front of her. So just to kind of clear that up a little bit. One of the things that we know is that, especially as those patterns are developed, people were going to make mistakes. And so one of the things we do is that we teach folks regularly that, listen, this is what we're going to do because this is what keeps her safe. And we can talk about the harm that's done by using incorrect pronouns or names. You don't want to be called the wrong name, or misgendered in some way that is not what you identify with. But when you make mistakes, the best thing you can do is correct yourself and move on. And so that's a big piece of what we teach. We don't want to shame the people, right, who are trying to meet us in that. And that's the thing, going back to those relationships, we're depending on members of, at this point, our congregation to want to meet us somewhere in here. We're not going to shame them when they struggle, because I'm going to mess it up on a regular basis, and so are you. So how do we both correct ourselves and move on without getting bogged down and, again, making it about ourselves, and instead doing our best to protect the vulnerable person in front of us?
Yeah, so I think there's two things. It's if they want to do the right thing and they're willing to meet this expectation, then how do we help people practice and give them the tools to understand that language shifts are hard and change comes, and do all of that. Grace, not spiral into shame. And then there are those folks that don't want to listen, that are saying, no, I will not use that name and pronouns. It goes against my personal beliefs or whatever it may be. And what I would say, and we will touch on this again later, but what I would say is that it comes down to boundaries and expectations. What does it mean to be in community together? And so whether it's at church, whether it's at home, or I do tons of trainings with camp staffs, what is your covenant of what it means to be in community here? Well, we don't call names. Okay, so by calling someone by a name they don't go by, you're calling a name. And so that's not allowed in this space. If you're struggling to use the right name and pronouns because it feels wrong to you, or you have some sort of personal belief that is preventing you, then how can we help you through that? Can we avoid using pronouns altogether? Can you just use the person's name? Because sometimes it's the pronouns that trip them up. Maybe they really don't understand they, them pronouns and are just this is not something I'm not going to do. It's grammatically wrong, which isn't true. But so fine, just use that person's name. Okay. If we still can't do that, if the name is different and doesn't feel okay, then you're just not going to refer to that person. We can set a boundary to say you can be in community with us, but you cannot call them by the wrong name or the wrong pronouns. You cannot act out in that way. Sometimes it's a little oversimplified. I will say all beliefs can be welcome here, but all behaviors are not. So I don't need you to sign on to the statement of belief that you agree with everything we've done and endorse it, but you cannot do harm. And so at some point it will say you can't be in this community with us if you are going to harm people in our community. In the same way that if someone was coming and spouting harmful ideas about anything else, or bringing a weapon openly to church, or whatever it may be, we would say that's not okay. This is a boundary, and these are the expectations for how we show up in this community. Does that make sense?
I think so. May I ask a
Yep.
follow-up clarification?
Absolutely.
So what I'm hearing is, in the absence of sympathy to the viewpoint, in the absence of working with you, with someone who is just recalcitrant about pronouns, what I'm hearing is, with the can't language, I'm not hearing an interpersonal technique that avoids the escalating power struggle. It is as if someone's got to go. Either we go or you go, and that is what we're looking at.
I mean, at some point, I think it is important for us to say that we are going to keep some level of safety for people that are vulnerable in our communities. And so I think having a conversation and saying, listen, I understand, and so maybe that's what I'm not quite modeling here, but I can have a conversation with someone and say, listen, I really understand you don't believe in this, you don't agree with it, this is really, or maybe you're struggling with this or you just don't know, and I totally support you on that, and would love to have more conversation with you or get you resources or be in relationship with you in that. But what we can't do, and I think this is a can't, you can't call that person by a name. You wouldn't let them call them any other name. And so it comes down to a behavior. In order to be in community together, you don't have to agree, you don't have to tell them you agree, but we have to have boundaries where we can't actively attack people, which is what misgendering and calling people by names that they don't go by is. Does that make sense? I think there's a lot of grace and empathy and compassion that comes into that relationship when you have that conversation. But I do think at some point, I mean, for instance, like these are the expectations for what it means to be church together. You can't call, like if you came in calling anybody else any other name, that would be inappropriate, and we wouldn't say you could stay here and continue to do that behavior.
Sure. So what I'm hearing is
Yeah.
it does escalate into a material power struggle over whose can't, whose shouldn't can be enforced. And my original question was basically, are there techniques where that doesn't have to be the way? And what I'm hearing is,
For sure.
on the outlying persons who aren't sympathetic, that's kind of where we are and where it is going to be.
So, a couple of things. I think we do have to, and we'll do some of this, we're going to talk a little bit later about the difference between unsafe and uncomfortable, and that's a piece of this conversation. And what I keep going back to is, and this would be a conversation, right? And I don't know where it would go, but it would start something like, so tell me why you're a member of this congregation. What's the purpose you have in being a piece of the mission that we're called to together? And we're going to find a place where that mission probably involves recognizing the shared identities of who we are as children of God and keeping each other safe. And for me, that's an intersection to be able to talk with this person about harm being done. And then the last piece, and I'll sit here and I'm a pastor who's read my Constitution language on. At some point, our congregations have a responsibility that allows us to say, you can't be a member here anymore. You've done too much harm and you are unwilling to come to this table in the way that we've laid out as the proper process. I never want to do that, but there is a reason why it's in our model constitution. And I think we need to recognize that reality. And while we'll grieve, the end result of that, of course, is we keep them in prayer and do ministry and don't necessarily lose contact, and we hope for all kinds of other things as a result. But as a pastor, I do have to sort of look at the reality of what it might mean that someone is no longer a safe member of someone is no longer able to be a member of our congregation because they're doing too much harm. And that's just reality. That's unfortunately.
But when I think you speak to the escalating, I think that yes, you eventually get there, but that's not, like, I think it's a long journey to that point. And so one of the things that I think
I've never had to do it in 20 years.
Well, yeah.
So, I mean, there is that piece of it. I certainly have members who do not agree with
Yeah.
us, our parenting, or all kinds of other things. But we figure out how to have those conversations and keep each other safe.
But as far as those skills, I think it's a lot of listening. Like, I mean, and we all know that we've learned to do that. But it's listening and hearing and not reacting to even when those come out really inflammatory things. Like, tell me why this is important to you, and really being willing to hear where they're coming from. And so I'll just use a camp example for a second, because we have these conversations a lot in camp. You know, so we might have a parent that calls an office at one of our outdoor ministry sites and says, like, you know, are there going to be boys in my girls' cabin, or blah, blah, or was there? Well, we can't share information about individual campers, fine, but these are our policies. This is what we do, and we can understand, well, that's not okay. Like, they can be, and they get very heightened and very upset because this is something really important to them for many levels. Usually fear is involved. And beyond fear, it's always fear is involved. Whether fear about the unknown or fear about something they always believed to be true and that they formed their worldview around cracking in front of them. It's terrifying, honestly. And so we can have some empathy for that and listen and say, okay, so tell me what you're concerned about, and do a lot of tell me more. And tell me more. And the first few minutes that you will hear will be, you know, all of the talking points out of the media that you've heard. And then maybe it's the first few hours. Who knows? Tell me more. Tell me more. What are you worried is going to happen? What are you concerned about? And at some point, you'll get down to something that's very real. In this example, you usually get to, well, I just don't want my daughter seeing the genitals of people that are different than her, or whatever. Like, I don't want my daughter to see a penis in her cabin at camp. Well, the good news is, oh my gosh, I wouldn't want that to happen either, because we don't want anybody seeing anyone's genitals. And so these are the practices and procedures we have in place to keep your child safe as well as everyone others. And so finding common ground, and maybe in that example, it's like really practical and actionable, which is lovely and still can help. But saying, you know what, I really care about that too. So maybe what they're saying is, I don't, like, this is against the Bible. Maybe it's a theology thing. This is wrong. I think we're going away from what God wants for us. Well, I'm really concerned about that too. And like being able to sit with them and wrestle with them and be in that with them without judging or shaming in a safe space. So making sure this isn't happening in front of trans people or other vulnerable communities, but really being with them and there's a tricky line of legitimizing their concerns, which we don't always want to do, like whether they're concerned about, you know, boys and girls bathrooms or whatever, but also what we're not is legitimizing their concern, but really hearing and validating their fear. And saying, like, I see what you're doing here. And being that relationship is where we start to then loosen the grip on the I absolutely won't do this to, okay, they're not saying that I'm crazy for thinking this. They're not telling me you're just not welcome here because you believe differently. In that relationship of wrestling and talking and all of those, there's a wall that eventually comes down that doesn't always make them willing to say, okay, fine, I will continue to wrestle with this, but I'm not going to call them by that name. I'll just avoid it or whatever, be able to find that middle ground. Does that make sense?
This was all helpful, yes, thank you.
Okay.
I'm so grateful for the both of you. I just have to say that. And then how is it that this seminary, faculty and staff, can better prepare future pastors and deacons to be open and inclusive in their congregations in ways that are life-affirming for all the people in the pews?
Mm-hmm. Pastor, I'm going to let you take that first. You like that, right?
No. I mean, I think we are going to ground ourselves in who we are as a church. We're going to then do what we can to recognize our shared identity as children of God, made in God's image, and we're going to move out from there. Every time we have to question that, we're going to go back to that to figure out where we go. And that's just sort of a good practice. That's why we write mission statements we then forget to read. But we're going to do it anyway. And I think that's a start. From there, there's a lot of practical pieces, and I think we're going to talk a lot about some of those as we sort of move on. That's the action piece of when we move past empathy, right? What that action actually looks like when we put it into practice in our congregations, our camps, our schools, our families, I mean, all of those things.
I mean, I think we start with modeling.
Right.
And so showing that it can be done in, a space that it's its own version of a bubble, let's be honest, and that this is what we can do and how we can show up in this space to be able to equip people to not have these ideas or experiences be new. I mean, so something very simple like sharing pronouns. What does that look like? How do we normalize it? How do we understand to use people's correct pronouns, to get used to using they, them? All of those kinds of things help create muscle memory so that when we're out in ministry settings, it's not the first time we're trying to figure out how to do it. And so that's one little example. What does it look like to have conversations where people disagree, where we can understand that we need to prioritize the most vulnerable while also create this idea that all beliefs can be welcome here, but all behaviors are not, and experience that so then we have some muscle memory so that when we're out in ministry settings, that is not the first time we're trying it. I also think not equipping leaders who are not afraid to learn about things outside of what is typically considered ministry, like understanding what's going on with trans people, understanding what it means for a young person to transition socially, legally, and medically, and all those kinds of things, may feel like it is somehow like superfluous to the work of ministry, and yet it is so necessary because you need to know to be able to correct misinformation, to be able to answer questions, to be able to support families in your community. And so really being willing to understand that we need a really broad view of the whole world and a lot of what's going on. And that can be really overwhelming and be like, I can't always do that. It's a matter of continuing committing to learning and continuing exposing ourselves. And when we have questions, to dig deep into those and find people we trust to teach about them, because it's all relevant in ministry.
Yeah, that's takes us to the slightly paraphrased Maya Angelou, right? It's when we know better, we do better. And we absolutely, and this is a hard thing for pastors to do on a regular basis, but to continuously look at the things that we need to learn that are outside of what we teach in any of our schools, no matter if it's seminary or anywhere else, that's outside of sort of our professional box, and say, I'm going to need to know more about the transgender community if I'm going to be able to do ministry, correct misinformation, etc. I think we see that, have historically seen that across all of our marginalized communities, though, and how we need to learn more about communities that don't look and live and perceive life the way we do.
So the other thing I would add is that we have to normalize getting it wrong.
Yes.
We're going to make mistakes. Too often we want to proceed and be perfect in whatever area we're doing. We want to do the right thing. And so a couple of things happen. We either don't do anything because we don't know how to do it perfectly, and that's a problem. Or when we make a mistake and someone tells us we've made a mistake, whether it's something as simple as a pronoun or something more complicated, we spiral into that shame that we mentioned earlier. We get really defensive. We do all those things saying, I'm really trying, or we double down, or whatever the case may be. And it is critically important as leaders of any kind, but especially in ministry settings, to be willing to say, I didn't know that, or thank you for sharing that with me. I'm going to go learn more about that. To be willing to get it wrong, to be in that uncomfortable space. What we don't want to be doing is churning out leaders who think that everything, they've got it all figured out, and that when someone tells them they don't, that they crumble underneath the weight of that. And so that comes with like the intellectual piece of knowing you have to keep learning and all of those things, but it also comes with the being present in your body. What happens when someone says, you've got this all wrong? When somebody calls me out or calls me in for doing something that is harmful to a community that maybe I'm a part of, but likely I'm not a part of? How do I respond? I can like clamp down and like shut it down and be like, they're attacking me and I'm not that person, not all Christians, I'm not racist, I'm not, whatever the case may be. Or I can be in that moment. I can take a deep breath I can feel what's coming up in my body. For me, usually my chest gets tight and I get that like panic feeling, and I can take a breath and be there and know that I am a beloved child of God, and I am I'm called to the work I'm doing, and clearly I missed something here. And so if you can breathe through that, then you can step in to learn more. And that, I think, is the number one skill that I would want for people going into ministry of any age in any context.
I may have heard from a really good preacher I know just a couple of weeks ago when Jesus may have been corrected by a Syrophoenician mom about who he came to heal, that Jesus didn't spiral into shame and say, oh, it wasn't me. Jesus healed her and moved on.
It's fun when I get to be the preacher.
Thank you for sharing your stories. I've known your stories for a while, but I got some new advantage for hearing them again. And when I was thinking about you, Chris, about to go into a congregation to invite them to embrace Rebecca as who she really was, it seems to me that the first thing you said was you talked about those people who were already people you could trust. All right, and so you had the advantage in the community of knowing the leadership and those people you could trust. You knew who the allies were on other things. I'm wondering about how a person or a family in a congregation does that same thing without having the pastor being the ally that they can be, and how they can sense the trust that needs to be engaged in order to begin those conversations and to be able to get it wrong together. So, okay, just thought.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've done some work, and organizations like Reconciling do a lot of work with congregations about how we do a good job on a broad spectrum of making welcoming and inclusive spaces. And one of the things that we know is that queer families especially are always looking for the things that will tell them whether a space is safe or not. And if they don't see those things, even from outside the building, they're going to assume, correctly or incorrectly, and it does not matter, they are going to perceive that this is not a safe space, and they won't go there because they've been harmed enough and they don't need to be harmed again. And so we talk about things like signage, right? And what kind of signage we put up. So this is something that's not even about persons, but about what we do as in infrastructure in our buildings. Whether that's if you are a reconciling congregation, you put the emblem up, you put it somewhere prominent, you make sure people can see it outside of the building. What kind of signage do we have on our restrooms? What kind of signage do we put on our name tags? Are pronouns a standard that everybody knows is important beyond the pastor, right? So that everybody shares them. That makes a big difference when we're going into those spaces, when especially queer families are going into those spaces and looking for the tells that they know mean that this just might be a safe space for them.
Yeah, so individually and institutionally, queer people are all looking for clues every time we enter any space. And so like Rebecca does this at school, I do this when neighbors move in, we do it in every church I walk into, and those clues can be like some of the institutional ones. They can also be that you share your pronouns, or that you have pronouns on your social media platforms, or when I walk around our neighborhood, the latest thing that me and my 10-year-old do, he likes to be walked every night, kind of like the dog, which is hysterical, but so we take the dog for a walk and then we take Oliver for a walk. He really loves the practice. And so is noticing what signs people have out. Those go for political signs, but even like, hate has no home here, or whatever other kind of, or a little rainbow flag, or those things. And he is learning about his neighbors and who he feels safe for or less safe with as a result of that. And so people are constantly looking. Now, a single clue doesn't tell you everything. Like, that sign doesn't mean everything, but it's a clue. And so equipping people that you're in relationship with to embody those clues, to share those clues, and to help signify to people that you're a safe person is really important. And then also understanding from an organizational standpoint, what does it look like for your congregation or ministry setting to be embodying those things and putting them into place. Now, that's also, you can't stop there. That you have to have done the work to be that safe place, and we'll talk more about that after lunch too. But it's the idea that you're looking for those allies. Literally every room I walk into, I'm looking for the clues of, okay, if something goes, like if I've got a problem, I can tell that person because of what they're wearing or something on their bag or the way they introduce themselves to me is going to be someone that can support me in this. And that is true for all people that are a part of the LGBTQ plus community.
Thank you again. So a lot of this is about, excuse me, personal, interpersonal, and maybe the second half you get more into, but you showed a slide, 658 new bills introduced. And we know that on the MAGA end, one of the advantages for them is those people are engaged and they are writing their senators and their representatives, and they are giving the impression that this is what my constituents want. Will you be addressing the activism side of this and how we engage not just personally with each other, but politically?
Yeah, absolutely. We will talk about it a little bit more later, but I mean, I'll take the opportunity. People of faith, specifically Christians, are doing the most significant harm to this community, personally, politically. It is up to us to advocate not in spite of our faith, but because of our faith, and to mobilize our communities to do the same. Lives are at risk, and helping, we start with the education, we start with the empathy, which is then we move into the action. I mean, and so that's where we'll be going this afternoon. But the idea that we create that personal connection in any way, whether it's with people in your community or through doing an education piece, and then we say, okay, now that we know this, now that I see you as the human being, as the child of God you are, what does it mean for me to advocate for you as my sibling in Christ? And so absolutely, it means calling your legislators. It means postcard writing parties. It means just being public in all the ways, whether it's your library, your board of education. Find out, do you have affirming policies? Is your library supporting diverse books? Call them, ask them, and then say thank you. As a person of faith in this community, this is important to me. Naming that it's because you are a person of faith is critically important because they are hearing people say the opposite, and they need to know that that is not the only faith voice there. Knowing what's going on at your state legislature and federally, being aware, getting connected to your local and statewide advocacy organizations. Every state has an equality organization. New Jersey's is Garden State Equality. Pennsylvania's, I think, is Equality PA, I believe. You're a really big state, so Pennsylvania's Pennsylvania. But they have some statewide stuff, and then you can get more connected to local stuff to understand what's going on and what is the call to action. Having people of faith, people in collars, people in vestments, whatever the case is, show up at protests, at rallies, at the legislature is critically important, not only for legislators to see, but also for the other people that are there, for the people of all ages that are there because it's their identity and see you doing that. Now, the caveat I will say is that religious trauma is real. Please don't, I like the free mom hugs, free pastor hugs, those things. Don't hug anybody without consent. Do not enter their space without consent. You can be there as an advocate, but don't make it about you. It's not about you. And that's really important. So there's like my crash answer, but we'll talk about it more later too.
And that actually brings me to my second,
Okay.
It's not a follow-up at all, but what you just said and what you were saying previously. I also am a parent of 3 Gen Z kids who, it's beautiful because to them, none of this makes sense because it is so obvious that we are all special and, loved and,
Yeah.
Anyway, so one of our children is extremely passionate to the point where we have to get them to tone it down a little bit because when their 80-something grandparents don't understand, they get angry at the grandparents
Yeah.
and is that something that you guys talk about when you go to schools? Not just
Yeah.
being inclusive, but not being,
Yeah.
aggressive.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I spend a lot of time with summer camp staff, and if you want to meet some wonderful Gen Z young adults who are very passionate about creating safe spaces, so passionate so that they sometimes create unsafe spaces for other people, then you will find them there. And so it is, how do we avoid shaming someone? Well, yes, we'll talk about this more. Again, we're talking about a lot in the afternoon. I'm getting worried. No, but when we talk about the difference between uncomfortable and unsafe, we'll unpack that. And when we shame someone, we're shifting them into an emotionally unsafe place. And so exactly how do we do that? So thank you for that. So grateful for all of the engagement. We have a lot more to cover at this afternoon, so I do hope you'll join us.
And please join me in offering thanks for this moment. Now, we do have what I feel are probably not enough copies of the book. It's a happy problem. So, and Jamie has graciously offered to autograph them. So she'll be at the table out here in the hallway after this session. And then we'll be making our way over to chapel for worship at noon, which is followed by a community lunch to which all of you are welcome. And that is in that room immediately next door. So we look forward to seeing you at worship and at lunch and back here for the afternoon session at 2 o'clock. And again, thank you both for being so awesome.
Thanks for having us.